right. Well, my Bluetooth alarm says it's 12 o'clock on the nose. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I just dropped in the chat and I'll copy it again for those of you who are just joining us. If you will take a moment to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat, your name, agency, and share what city or state you are in. And if you want to message me privately and share your email with me, you can. Otherwise, I'll track you down in the app later. So good afternoon and welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Teresa Reed and I will be your cruise director for the next 59 minutes. So welcome, welcome. So let's get started. I've got lots of stuff prepared for you in our PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, before I do that, you have the option. I know right now I'm spotlighted, but you have the option to change the view within your personal Zoom. And you can go, I believe, up to the right-hand corner and change your view if you want to do gallery view to be able to see participants. I like to see faces. So if you all would like to show your face on screen, thank you. Archives, am I saying it right?
Archives, yes.
Archives, okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. I like to see faces, I know we've gotten so accustomed, there's pros and cons to this virtual environment, right? And so sometimes we get a little burned out. And then we also try and multitask. And so we're really losing our human interaction. So one day we'll get back to our new normal and we actually do these live and connect and join each other. So, but I think it gives us an opportunity to attend spaces that we maybe wouldn't have otherwise given the new climate we have going on. So again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Good afternoon to everyone. Just dropped a note to introduce yourself and say hello. Because if I have you all on mute and do this, that would be our hour just saying hello and introducing ourselves. So, but I like to know who's in the room. I like to know what agencies you're with, who I'm speaking to. I can tailor some of my comments and ad libs to who's in the house. So lots of Californians in the house. Thank you, Lori. Got that. Oh, Missouri. Okay. Cool. Oh, San Diego, one of my favorite places to be. All right. All right. Well, I am actually in Pasadena, California. And so welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you for selecting to spend your session with me. And it's, such a small world. So I don't know, this isn't my first time at the conference, but some of you may have sat through my workshop before. And that's always the truest compliment, to be asked to return or for someone to say, hey, I know I sat through this before, but I have some new material. So if you did sit through my workshop before, I have really shifted the way I've been approaching this idea of trauma. And I share with people, I wasn't given a middle name at birth, so there's not one on my birth certificate, but I now have adopted the middle name of trauma. I've done lots of research on it. I actually have some books. We're going to talk about that in a moment. A book series called It's Not Drama, It's Trauma. And as a former foster youth, that was a part of my therapeutic healing process. Therapy wasn't required back in dinosaur days. That's what I tell the kids, and they always like, dinosaur days. Yeah, that was a long time ago. But back in the 80s, when I was in foster care, therapy wasn't required, probably should have been. And so as I got older and really realized how much my life was impacted from being in foster care, reframing and rethinking and reliving my story, and then also trying to make this concept of trauma non-clinical. So our everyday lives, we're not clinicians. I'm not clinician by trade, but a lot of times the idea of trauma and being trauma informed is a clinical kind of thing, but it's not when you're living with it on the day-to-day. Clinical is not in the adjectives and definitely not something you want to think about because we are humans first. And so as I was on the journey of healing and understanding why I was doing things in my later years, in my 30s and 40s, it was a part of my healing process to, particularly with interpersonal relationships. And I had decided, I don't want to be old and alone. And I didn't want to be a cat lady because I don't like cats. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna need to do something a little bit different for this future, this future outlook. So this was part of my process and really making sense of why things either triggered me or I did things that it was easy to push folks away. Oh, okay. You don't really agree with it. You know what? Let's just end this now because I know how it's going to end up anyway. So let's just save both of us some time. And so I was not taught to have disagreements, and you can still get along. You disagreements for the moment, but you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I had a new meaning to this cliche. So let's talk about this idea of trauma. And so I've been really spending a lot of time in the last year or two looking at, well, I actually have a new term for it because I started looking at it while I was working on my doctorate and trying to decide on dissertation, which, yeah, I'm not done with all of that yet. So we'll pick that journey back up, but it's still something on my list of things to do. But I was really examining what people were, all these agencies are becoming trauma informed, particularly as I worked with the school district, and it's like, they're becoming trauma informed because they're sitting through workshops. But I wasn't seeing practice, wasn't seeing things done differently. We're still saying the same numbers and statistics when it comes to youth in foster care and children in foster care. And unfortunately, my brothers and sisters in care are having greater manifestations of the trauma they are experiencing because they are having greater inputs to the trauma they're receiving. I don't know if people are Googling stuff or people putting on the internet ways to be more horrific and more abusive, and then doing things to kids that just, I really have no words for it. And so when you're encountering youth in the work that you're doing that seem to be even more challenging, yeah, their life was even more challenging than the last cohort that you worked with. So looking at how to give some strategies and some relief. So with that, let's share PowerPoint, because I'll get on my soapbox and we'll, get very personal, but I'm not going to do that. So shifting from trauma informed to trauma responsive engagement. So being informed is one thing, but what are we doing with it? So we're going to talk about what it really means to be trauma responsive versus just trauma informed. We're not throwing out the old concept, but we're just adding some layers to it. Okay, so we're going to define what it means to be trauma informed and then actually define trauma. Trauma is one of those words people, oh yeah, I know what it is. I use it all the time. Oh, but I don't really know how to put it in words, but I know what it is. It's like, okay, so we're going to give some words to actually put to your definition. Then we're going to talk about a few types of trauma and then look at trauma's impact on so many things. These are very brief bullet points, and then define responsiveness and then give you some tools. So I will be uploading the PowerPoint later to WOVA, and there's some handouts that I will be giving you for class. Oh, and I just restarted my computer, so now sitting there. So I'm not going to be dropping them in chat, but I will make them available in the app. Okay. And you're always welcome to reach out to me. So these are just our objectives: defining trauma and its impact on development and regulation, the R word. Yes. And then at the end of this class, being able to articulate the difference in being trauma informed versus trauma responsive. And then I want to share with you the elements of what is called secondhand shock syndrome and how it impacts your ability to be trauma responsive. And then learn strategies to recognize and address your own trauma triggers. Well, we're not just talking about the kids today. And then practice using trauma-informed responses when working with students, youth that you encounter. So that's my goal for you at the end of our time today. So I mentioned the books. So there's the middle one's been released. That's the first one in the series. Here's the second one in the series. Let's see, let's do that magic, that sweet spot with the virtual background. I had it. Okay. So that's the second one. So I'm actually read from it. That's why I have it in hand. But it's not drama, it's vicarious trauma. Recognizing and reducing secondary traumatic stress. And then, got excited on the screen. And then the third one is due to be released soon before foster care month. And this is from foster youth to foster youth. And so, and yes, that's me when I was 13, when I first went into foster care. So I was like, how fitting to be able to put some real persons that I actually know on the cover. So, and then so I do workshops with foster youth, and we've identified our superpowers. And so that's a lot of what the book is going to be about, and kind of making sense of our experience, because a lot of times we run and hide from it. And it's something we're ashamed about, or no one has made sense of it for us. And so I'm trying to help my brothers and sisters so they don't have to wait until they're 40 to start making sense of, and lots of losses in between, right? There's lots of things that I've lost on the way that I could have minimized the loss had I been more aware of what was going on with me. So that's a little bit of who I am. So with that, I want to start with, we're going to take a breath. So sometimes in all the work that you're doing, all you have time to do is breathe. You don't have time to go do a yoga class, take a long walk, get a sip of something that makes you feel a little bit better. Sometimes to reclaim your space, all you have time to do is breathe. So I just want you to take a moment and breathe in your nose and out your mouth. And feel your lungs fill up. So while you're taking some cleansing breaths, I want to take a moment to say thank you and actually read a letter that's part of the dedications in this particular book. So It's Not Drama, It's Vicarious Trauma is dedicated to the champions who work with, support, or care for those who've experienced trauma. Dear champion, that's you. You have survived the last 3 years. We're going to say this was originally written in 2020, but you have survived, different names for it. We're still in the pandemic phase. We're not over it, but you've survived it with grace and humility. Thank you for having the heart to help others. You may be a therapist, a counselor, a mental health provider, a social worker, a medical provider, a teacher, an advocate, principal, or even a caregiver. And so my apologies if I missed listing anyone specifically. That was not my intent. But whatever role you play, this book and this workshop is dedicated to you for the tireless efforts you expend to support those who are the most vulnerable because of their traumatic past. To provide the level of care needed, I am aware that you give of yourself and you take on a little bit of their stories and experiences with each interaction. However, as you do this and take on these pieces and empathize, it can cause you to experience signs and symptoms of trauma yourself. I hope you find this book and the workshop illuminating to know that someone acknowledges the work that you do takes strength and character. I also hope that it provides strategies that are comforting so you can continue to do the work that you've been so passionate about. I applaud you for implementing trauma-informed principles with those you are caring for. I encourage you also to be mindful and practice being trauma-informed with yourself. This includes taking care of yourself first and regularly. So some people, self-care, what is that? That was your new definition of self-care. So a special shout out and heart to you all. Where's my reactions? I always like to be able to, here it is. A special heart and shout out to you all for the work that you're doing, and you just keep jumping back in it day after day. So let's talk about what you're doing and give some strategies. So thank you for that. All right, so what does it really mean to be trauma informed? So the basic definition, it means to consider the potential for exposure to trauma and being sensitive at initial approach to create an environment that is emotionally, physically, and psychologically safe. So when you say there, first impression, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. For the youth that you're working with, you don't get a chance to have a do-over and make that first impression. So from that first impression, that initial contact, and that initial contact could be when you make the phone call to set an appointment. Your first contact isn't when you're having your first intake, first class, first meeting. Your initial approach is how you make that phone call when you're trying to set an appointment, or the tone and how you send that email, the flyer when you're reaching out. That is part of the initial approach. And so it's not enough just to say there's a physical safe space, but looking at the emotional and psychological safety for someone who has experienced trauma. So let's break down and define this thing called trauma. What is it really? So it's layered. It's complicated. And this is not Facebook status, but it's complicated. And so I see trauma as a disruption in your perceived reality. Well, what do you mean by that, Teresa? Great question. Disruption in your perceived reality. Here's an example. I left home with the intent of being here. I'm supposed to be here at 9. Shh, I'll talk about that. So I leave home at 8:40 with the intent of being at work at 9 o'clock, figuring out which route, but trying to allow some cushion. That is my perceived reality. It's going to take me 15 to 20 minutes, get to the parking lot, be at my desk. I get in the car, the route that I decided to take based on GPS, and I encounter and get into a car accident. Now, my perceived reality of being at work at 9 o'clock has now been disrupted. I may get there a few minutes later, not at all, depending on the level of damage. However, my perceived reality of being at work at 9 o'clock has now been disrupted. And then it alters your sense of well-being. So again, let's use the analogy of the car accident. I'm gonna try not to get too emotional here with you. We'll try and keep it a little more surface. But the idea of a car accident, your sense of well-being is now altered. Now you're worried about being late to work, what your boss is gonna say. You might be in shock, depends on how significant the car accident, or your brand new car and it's scratched up and it's dented. Or, right now you don't feel anything, but are you going to feel something later? Or is the other person okay? So your sense of well-being and calm has now been altered. So the situation, the event, it could be a one-time event, or it could be a set of circumstances. Hopefully with the car accident, it's not a set of circumstances, it's an accident is at one time. However, trauma can be for our young people experiencing domestic violence. It could be a set of circumstances. Some of our children are being trafficked, sex trafficked, a set of circumstances. And the event can be either emotional or physical. We're going to talk about that a little bit because in the work that we do, we're being emotionally traumatized and may not even realize it. And in this case, AKA abused. Physical abuse and trauma is pretty straightforward, easy to recognize. The emotional, not always. And then the trauma can represent a direct hit, like the car accident, something happened to you directly, or a threat of harm. So maybe in the workplace, you're being threatened, well, if you don't continue to perform or you don't get here on time, then you're not going to have your job or you're not going to get the promotion. So the threat of those kinds of things, or depending on the people that you're working with, the clients you're working with, there can be, threat of harm if you don't help them get the services they need, or if you don't stop asking me all these questions. All of that has the same effect on your brain as if you had been hit over the head with a stick. And trauma can also represent direct harm to you or threat to you or even others that you relate to. Have you ever wondered why you hear things on the news, even though you weren't there? You may not even know the people, but it still causes you to clutch your pearls, is the kind of term that we use, kind of pause and just like, whoa, okay, I'm gonna need a minute. Because we relate because we are humans. When we hear about things happening to other people, our brain has the same reaction as if it had happened to us. Maybe not as intensive, but still that fight, flight, or freeze is still activated. And then how you are affected, as I just mentioned, is relative. Some of the youth that you're encountering, they've lived through, their life is one big set of trauma. So when you're talking about how you experience something, like, well, that was normal. That was something I lived through all the time. So maybe gunshot sounds don't bother me because that was just kind of what we dealt with. For our children who are trafficked, the idea of abuse, sexual abuse, it's hard for them to see the ills of sex trafficking because all of their life they've been abused in some form or another. So that's our written definition of trauma. Any questions? I know we're kind of going on, but I do like to entertain questions. I will ask if I'm talking, you have a specific question, you can chat it to either Ryan or Daniel. Or you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and then that way it will pop up. I can get to a comfortable pause, and then I can address your questions, okay? All right, so a type of trauma that I wanted to talk about, and that is called collective trauma. Means collective, we are all, let's see, how many of us are in here? There's 62 of us in the room. We are all experiencing this together. We're all impacted by it collectively and individually. So how it shows up for us individually is relative. How it shows up depends on your sense of community is going to also be relative. So let's break down a little bit on collective trauma. All right, so collective trauma is the impact of a traumatic experience that affects and involves entire groups of people, communities, or societies. All of us attending this conference, we are all a part of the same community, or you could even say society. Excuse me. So what we've been experiencing since March, knowingly since March 2020, we have all experienced that collectively. That's just an example. Other things about collective trauma. Not only can it bring distress and negative consequences to the individual, but it can also change the entire fabric of a community. The entire fabric of a community. So where there may be isolation, again, foster care for our students in foster care, it has changed. You have social workers still working remote. So there's changes in the community. Our young people who were accustomed to having family visits have not been able to have that. And some haven't really been completely restored. And even more so for our young people in foster care who have already been dealing with a lot of trauma, rejection, and isolation. Man, the pandemic just really took some folks over the edge and in a tailspin and just exacerbated and re-traumatized. And some of us haven't recovered from that. And so collective trauma can impact relationships, alter policies and governmental procedures or processes, and alter the way the society functions and even change its social norms. I put the picture of from 9/11, and one major change, there's a lot, but one that has affected everyone globally is travel. I remember the first time I traveled after 9/11, not knowing about the 311. So I had gone out and was all excited, had stocked up my supply. I was looking around my desk, my supply of my Victoria's Secret lotions and bath stuff. And so I had the whole bottle since I used to be able to travel with it before, brand new bottles. They were like, you can't take those. You can either go and, pack them and mail them back home or throw them away. It's not like water where I can sit and drink it all right before you pass through. And so I was like, what? That's $50 worth of stuff and I got to do what with it? And so a change behind a collective trauma. And so I want to kind of touch on that a little bit as we go through the rest of the PowerPoint. So in the chat, share with me, and I'm sorry I put some of mine up here, but what are new policies that are in place now that you are experiencing, whether it's at work, particularly in the work that you're doing with you? Share with me in the chat, or if anybody wants to raise their hand, and I like voices, you can talk to me. What are some policies that are now in place given the changes, the collective trauma we've all are still experiencing? Virtual classes, yes. So virtual classes, conferences, yes. What are some other policies or changes that are in place?
The vaccine.
Yes, to vaccinate, not vaccinate. How many boosters, how many layers, all the different kinds of things. Yes, and I mean, and that was a global requirement. Fewer social events, yes. Mask and negative test requirements to participate, yes. To go to a concert now. They still haven't done anything about making the seats wider apart or bigger, but that's another challenge we have to overcome. But I know people who still don't go out to restaurants because they're still not feeling safe and comfortable. So yes, this idea of collective trauma, it is showing up where that's affecting us in large ways. For me, things like Google Voice, I'm loving that. I'm like, where was this before? So I don't have to give out my phone number all the time, but I can use it, and then it transcribes messages, so I can get text messages, so I'm staying abreast. Oh, absolutely, Lauren, increased anxiety. And then the idea of working from home and not by choice. So then that increases anxiety. So absolutely. For us, this idea of VPN, I forgot the acronym, but where you have remote access to your networks at work, because for example, if we were going to punch in our time cards, we had to be here at school. Oh, by the way, I work for Pasadena City College. So I'm like, at school, where are you? So we had to be on campus to log in our hours. Well, with this idea of the VPN, we can now access our documents that were saved on our networks, and we could actually go in and do our timesheets. Medical insurance policies and codes for covering, virtual psychotherapy. All right, so very specific. Requirements for being in the same state as provider. Interesting, okay. Well, even just the idea of virtual therapy, that was something that was so unheard of. We had to go and sit down and lay down on the couches before, but now you can actually get assistance virtually. There's pros and cons to that, because for some, that's still anxiety provoking, still needing that contact. Hybrid schedules. I don't know who to advocate for us at work to be able to do hybrid. We are fully in person and on grounds. For us, we still do weekly COVID testing. And at one point it was absolutely required. Now it's optional. And then the online classes, virtual classes, and exchange of information, all because of this collective trauma. There's some benefits of some of the policy changes. Some of them can be overwhelming. So let's talk about another type of trauma, and that's emotion abuse, as I mentioned to you all. And this is something that I wanted to bring up because it really affects us in the work that we're doing, and we don't maybe not even realize it. So what is emotion abuse? So it involves words, acts, or omissions that harm a person's emotional stability or mental health, causing behavioral changes. And behavioral changes could represent so many things. You stop showing up at work. You no longer engage with folks that are abusive to you, talking unkind to you. Okay, so in the chat, what are some ways you are experiencing emotional abuse in the work that you're doing? Anybody? And you're welcome to unmute and share, or to put in the chat. What are some ways that you might be experiencing forms of emotional abuse? And as you all are typing, some things with the clients that you're working with, the unkind words, even though you know you're trying to be helpful, but you might be digging a little deep. What else? In the workplace, maybe being forced to continue to work remotely, and maybe your space isn't set up for that. Or maybe you've gotten accustomed to working remotely and you're protesting that you got to go back into the office, and your supervisor's not understanding, not offering the remote access or the hybrid. Gaslighting, yeah, that seems to be happening a lot more lately. And then not acknowledging when there's real harassment. So one, not acknowledging this idea of emotional abuse, and then you're feeling even more isolated. Unrealistic expectations about volume of work. I don't know why they think just because we're at home, we're supposed to be producing more work than we were in the office. Or the other thing I noticed is when did we get to the point that I was listening to a podcast from some school empowerment program, I don't remember which one it was, but they were talking about the fact that when do we go from working outside of our 9 to 5 hours and feeling like we had to be on call all the time? Just because you now have access to everything, shut it off. Shut it off. Say no. Taking away perks and privileges. Threats, you put it out there, take it back, or sometimes people will carry those things over you with having no intent of ever exercising it. I love it. I'm seeing not acknowledging and minimizing the work that you do. Absolutely. That's called withholding affection. When someone isn't appreciative of the work that you're doing, simple things like saying thank you go a long way. Yes, it's my job, but it's nice to be acknowledged because, man, there's so many people that yes, it's their job, but that's not what they're doing. Remote work causes insecurities and worries if you don't get the nuances. So yeah, maybe depending on the work that you're doing, it's hard to read certain kinds of things virtually. You're missing elements of your work, and then omissions and isolation. So yeah, and then there's some assumptions that, there's just parts of your, or excuse me, either assumptions that there's part of your work that you don't need to be doing, or continue to do parts of your work that really should be eliminated because you're working virtually. Oh, thank you, Angelina. Absolutely. Asking people to do more work with no compensation and support. I was in a meeting this morning, we were just talking about titles and how most of us have dual titles. I see you all were kind of very slim in your titles that you submitted, or that might be what your title is, but the work that you do could be in multiple areas. Yes, but with no compensation or support. And sometimes that support is the support of regularly meeting with your supervisor to do check-ins. And so I also want to encourage you, as you're sharing some of these things, thinking about what are things that you can do yourself or in your environment amongst your colleagues. We're going to talk about that. Refusing to acknowledge best practice and to update research within program development for youth. And that's one of the major principles of being trauma informed. Imagine that, right? Anger transference from superiors. Stuff trickles down here, y'all. So yeah, and then there's not much you can do about it, and you feel like you have to take it. And then, like, who are you supposed to go to for that harassment when it's the supervisor that you're supposed to go and report it to is the one that's bringing it down on you? Yes, and then not feeling empowered to do. You're not feeling empowered to do anything about it, and that's a heavy burden to carry. It's a heavy burden to carry. All right, so thank you all for sharing, and it's important for us to acknowledge. So you all are being traumatized even in your work while you're working with those who are experiencing trauma. So I want to get through, make sure I get some strategies for you. All right. So here's some examples. Invalidating, you all kind of talked about that, not acknowledging or minimizing what you're doing, verbally attacking you, again, because stuff trickles down here. They may have gotten yelled at by their supervisor, and then now they're yelling at you. Isolating. Working remotely can be isolating, you all. Maybe you're used to spending time, even your annoying coworkers, you miss being able to spend time in their presence. But then also the isolating is you may not have quick access to technical assistance or the assistance and support of your supervisor, where maybe you used to be able to just go right next door and ask a question right in the moment. You don't have access to that. Extremely pressuring you kind of to something Angelina was saying, in the pressure to do more work without compensation, or, okay, we're working on it. Yeah, are you really? How about you fix that and then give me the work to do? Yeah, that's not how that works. And then withholding, you mentioned that, withholding affection, appreciation. Those are all ways that we are being affected in the work that we're doing. Even when your clients, they get up and run out and don't say, oh, thanks for a great session, thanks for the class. Those are all forms of withholding. All right, so you may see or experience these kinds of traumatic responses based on the things that you've been experiencing. And I just want you, if you're comfortable, this is optional, but just observing some ways that over the last couple of years, have you found yourself either having a loss of temper, and whatever that looks like for you, because it's going to vary, maybe being a little more irritable or even defensive, then your fight, we're talking about the fight, flight, or freeze, your fight has been activated. Or have you found yourself being more avoidant with your clients, with work, higher levels of anxiety, and someone mentioned that in there, or fear, lots of uncertainty. When is this going to end? If I choose to stay remote or fight for that, am I going to lose my job? How is that going to relate? Or when we go back in person, and we drop the mask and the social distancing, how is that going to affect my health? Do I want to do that? Are they going to lax on the sanitizing? There's still lots that we need to still be doing around that, you all. And if those are kinds of things, then maybe your flight has been activated. So I just want you to share in the chat if you want to, have you found yourself being activated, your fight, flight, or freeze? And then freezing, it feels like numbing. It's like, okay, I'm doing this, I'm here, but or feeling detached from your work, from your connection with the youth. Or have you found yourself just giving up very easily? It's like, all right, whatever. Okay, if I don't have to, then fine. So just in the chat, share with me if you found yourself over the last couple of years experiencing any of these. And it's purely optional, but just wanted to kind of share, because a lot of times we recognize it in our clients, but we don't realize where we have been activated. And yes, you all, as big as your S's on your chest, as superheroes working in this field, you do also experience some of these things. Okay, some of you see the freeze. Yeah, absolutely. It's like, all right, what's the absolute minimum? I found myself being a minimalist sometimes at work, and that was not my way before. So thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so all of the above at some time, depending on the situation. And because a lot of times we think fight, flight, or freeze, fight, we want to do this or take off running, but it's not always that dramatic. Okay. Thank you all for sharing. And part of it is acknowledging. So let's kind of talk about, now that you know these things, what's really going on. So when we experience these things over a prolonged period, it could lead to what is called secondhand shock syndrome, which is, some of these you're familiar with it, but it's really the first three: compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and vicarious trauma. Because now that's a section in the DSM. So it is possible that you could experience all three of these. And so compassion fatigue is where you're just emotionally and physically exhausted. Have you ever gotten to the end of the day and you can just barely walk through the door and you're like, wait, I didn't work out, I didn't run. Why am I so exhausted? And then secondary traumatic stress, where you internalize the traumatic experiences after listening to the stories of others. So sometimes you have to listen to stories to figure out how to best work with clients. And sometimes you internalize it and you avoid things that they're avoiding, that you might be avoiding. Maybe you talk to a young person and their parent was really abusive and you're supposed to be helping them set up visitations. But when the parent comes to visit, you're kind of sitting there with attitude. You're kind of like, I don't know that they have the right to spend time with the child, and don't even realize that you are now a little hyper alert. And then vicarious trauma is one we're a little more familiar with, but trauma from another's experience because you've heard, watched, or read. The thing about vicarious trauma is, because you want to minimize the hurt that people are experiencing, you take on a little bit of it yourself and don't even realize it. From hearing their experiences, you're like, let me take a little bit away from you. But after a while, a little bit from this person, a little bit from this, your body starts to react as if you've had PTSD, but you can't pin it to a particular event because it has been a culmination. And then there are things like burnout, chronic workplace stress, and especially now that you're working home, there's not a whole lot of separation for some of you. You're like, how do I get a sense of relief? And then moral injury, and I found this one to be interesting. So moral injury is really a deep soul wound that you experience when there's a conflict between what you're required to do and what you feel morally comfortable doing, or when there's a limitation in your capacity on something that you know that needs to be done, but you can't because of policies and some things outside of your control. You all have big hearts, big E's. So actually big E's instead of big S's, big E's for empathy on your chest. And sometimes there's a moral dilemma about what you want to do, crossing boundaries, and what you can do. And then being told no on some things that you were like, but it's really not going to cost as much. Why can't we do that to be more efficient in the work that we're doing? So the youth that you've worked with before, and even some of your coworkers before a pandemic, they were more cheery, talkative. Some of the things on the left, more socially engaging. Some of you do classes and workshops. I work at the school, so, higher GPAs. We were seeing some of these things, even well-groomed. Now you might see changes where we talked about anxiety, maybe more paranoid, depends on conversations, impatient, more irritable, even curt in their conversations with you, unkempt. Well, I'm just going on Zoom, so why do I need to comb my hair? Kids struggle going back to school because they've been so used to doing school in their pajamas. They're like, why can't I wear these to school? You can't go outside in your pajamas. And no, you should still comb your hair and be presentable. You may see more feelings of helplessness and despair. And again, because we're still in this collective trauma, you all. So you might see reduced GPAs for some of the youth that you're working with, and higher levels of anxiety. And this kind of anxiety is what I call what's called hypothetical worry. So what can you do when you're working with someone that has such increased levels of anxiety? You can encourage them to work on the things on the pink list on the left side, things that are within their control, and maybe helping them define what's in their control. So this is your first strategy, helping them to define what's within their control and focusing on that. Things like building their resiliency, focusing on what's important to them. Let them, encourage them, well, what is important to you? And ask them. They can control things about their diet, their routines. There's been some changes, but for asking them to take a look at what are things in your routine that you can control. They have control of seeking and offering support. And for you all offering support, you should be putting curfews on your time that you're offering support. That's a part of your self-care. None of this, I'm available whenever you need me 24/7. No, put a curfew on it. They have control over cultivating connections. It may look different. Speaking of connections, I have a brother that lives on the other side of Bakersfield, so I hadn't seen him for a couple of years, and he video chatted me through FaceTime. I was like, wow, why didn't we think of doing this before? And so it was so cool to see him because I hadn't seen him in a while. You have control over eating well, exercising, movement. And then now the sleeping and relaxing can be a little bit challenging, but there's still ways they can have control, and encourage them to find what works for them. And then acknowledging the things that are outside of their control. And you don't have to provide answers, but, is it safe to go back in person, back in the buildings? You can't answer that, but you can let them know, well, here's parts that you can do. You continue to be hygienic and wear your mask. If you have the option of in person or not in person, exercise your option. You can't control feeling distant or left out. It doesn't feel good, and it may come, but a lot of times that's perception. But here, how do you know what I'm doing behind my mask? You don't. Am I smiling? Am I frowning? Unless I do like Tyra Banks smiles, with the eyes from America's the Top Model. It can feel distancing, and then sometimes you can't hear people, but that's not something that you can necessarily control. Vaccinations, yeah. You have options on that, but it's not going to just go away. New strands of the virus. If I read one more article about something new that's popped up with some new derivative or name, boy, it can be overwhelming. Other people's health, you cannot control that. You can try and control your own and your exposure, but people are having health issues even before the pandemic. There's always been the cold and flu season. The news, you can't control that, but you can control your consumption of it. And maybe stop setting up things for automatic feed. You can't control aging. That's a part of the birth process. It's going to happen. You can control like how old you look and taking care of yourself, but there's things outside of our control that we worry about. And so comforting the people that you're working with, and here's some things that are outside of your control. They might be worrying you, but recognize and put them in this box because you can't stop it or fix it. And then schools opening or closing. It's outside your control. Yes, it's nerve-wracking, but it's not something that we can control individually. And so when we're experiencing traumatic events, and the youth that you're working with, trauma and it impacts your ability to regulate your emotions. So dysregulation occurs when the brain responds to sensory input in a manner that triggers that fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn response. That is what dysregulation is. And it can be for a short time, but you're working with young people who've been in foster care, so they've been dysregulated for a long time, or someone's not helping them to work on that regulation. And so when you're dysregulated, even for us, think about when you're dysregulated and you seem to be more sensitive to things. Well, somebody yelled at you before. Well, you know, that's par for the course, but why is it so heavy for you now? Or someone misses an appointment or shows up late. Why does it bother you now when it maybe didn't before? Because sometimes we're dysregulated. We've had losses. We're getting emotionally abused in the workplace, being invalidated, gaslight lit. So all of these things also are showing up and affecting us. Not just, and again, it's easier to recognize it in the clients. So when you're dysregulated, it's harder to listen, to comprehend, and to cope. That's with all of us. If you ever sat, maybe you're supposed to be doing intake or class or talking to someone, and you're like, I know I was just sitting here, but I don't remember anything we just talked about. And you try not to show that when, you know, because we get distracted too, you all. So part of working with our clients and recognizing when they're showing up this way, it's not them ignoring you. Stop taking it personal. They're not bored with your lesson, but when we're dysregulated, some of the things that we take for granted and be able to do without thinking about it, we're not able to do. So here are some tips. So we should supporting, and I still say students, supporting youth after trauma. So learning to respond versus react. And then we're going to talk about these pieces. So reacting, what is reacting? Reaction is an emotional subconscious decision that is made without considering the consequences, usually in haste. So it's not being sensitive at initial approach. You just kind of move about the cabin, or what we call knee-jerk reaction. You know, whoa, you said something, what? Just kind of flying off the handle. But when you respond, you're conscious in the effort that that you're taking. You actually take a step back. You breathe, make sure what you're seeing is what you're really seeing. Then you review the situation so that you become aware and present of what's happening, what's being said, and also being aware of your reactions and how it is affecting you. And then you attempt to figure out probable causes and consider available solutions. So you're going through this whole thought process to figure out, okay, what's happening? What's the best solution? So yes, does this take time? Yes, but not as long as you really think it does. But it's really about being conscious and present in the situation. So here's a video that I'd like to share. I love Dr. Han. So talking about what it really means to be trauma responsive. So I want you to take some notes, because one of the things I'm going to ask you to share with me is, what is your purpose? All right.
Hey, welcome back, everyone.
Can you all see in here? I'm sorry, Daniel, Ryan. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
I feel like we lost the sound.
Did we? Let's see.
Yeah, I lost audio.
Yeah, I did too.
Okay, let's try it again.
Takes to become a trauma-informed organization.
How about now?
And I think my answer is actually quite
Do we have sound again?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's working
Okay.
now. Yeah, thank you.
different from what other people say, because I think other people focus on what actions should be taken, what needs assessments need to be done, or what services need to be put in place. And for me, I think that the most important thing is the moment when a person is about to become trauma reactive, and how well everyone else can handle that situation without becoming trauma reactive themselves. Because what I've learned from doing interviews of offenders or students or anyone who uses these trauma-informed organizations is that the most important thing that makes or breaks a person's day is actually the moment-to-moment interactions with people. And people as random as like the lunch lady in the cafeteria who will give you a full serving of food or not, just based on whether or not they like you and how they feel that day. or whether or not a safety officer will use excessive discipline just because they're frustrated with you. Those little moment-to-moment things are really what make people feel safe in an environment. And what I don't get is that the hospitality industry completely understands this. Every five-star hotel or five-star restaurant knows that service is the foundation upon which the whole experience rests. And so I really think that trauma-informed organizations need to take a hospitality mindset. And what hospitality means in a trauma-informed organization, I think, is that you're always being sensitive and attentive to the other person's needs and sensitive to their trauma reactiveness, and the fact that you yourself can be trauma reactive, and that you have to always guard against going into survival brain yourself, and to amp up as much as you can your ability to stay clear, to stay purpose-driven and goal-directed and emotionally attuned to the other people. Okay, so then the first step in learning how to do that is actually to understand what your own survival brain looks like. Now for me, I know that when I get into survival brain, if I'm going into the aggressive mode, then I think people are stupid, that they have bad intentions, that they don't mean well, that they're only doing things to hurt other people. And then whenever I go into the withdrawal phase, I just want to give up on a project, give up on the people, think that they're never going to change. So when I realize that I'm in that alarm state, the first thing I do is just to slow things down as much as possible. Because I know that my body's been activated and I have adrenaline rushing through me and I'm feeling intense feelings, and there's no way that I can just snap out of it. I have to let my emotions and my body cool down on its own. So I have to have a lot of patience for myself. I also try to scan my body and get grounded in it again. And I try to take some deep belly breaths and take control of my breathing again. And the other really important thing to do is that I try not to get mad at myself for getting into that alarm state. Because I know that my alarm has only been activated because something really important to me is going on, or because I feel like something that I really care about is being threatened. And then once I do that, I try to figure out what page I'm on. And PAGE is an acronym that I just made up that I think captures the essence of how to de-escalate from an alarm state. And the first step of PAGE is to really remember what my purpose is. And by purpose, I mean my purpose in life, in the kind of life I want to live, and in the values that I uphold. And then I try to remember how this moment can be a moment when I'm trying to live my purpose in life. And then the next thing I do is try to figure out whether I'm being emotionally attuned to the other person. Because as alarms go up, then self-absorption kicks up, and I'm only worried about how this person's trying to attack me and whether I'm getting my needs and opinions across. And so this really helps me to slow down and pay attention to what's going on in the other person. And the next thing I do is to ask, what is the goal or intention of our meeting, this interaction, or even this very moment or this conversational turn? And when you're in an alarm state, you forget what the goal is and all you care about is self-protection. But if you remember what your goal is, then that can help you to stay focused on what you really want to accomplish and what you want to say and do. And then finally, I ask myself, what am I really feeling? And oftentimes, the only things I can understand are the anger and frustration. So I have to dig a little deeper and ask, what is the hurt or the vulnerability that I'm feeling that I really don't want to express to the other person because I'm feeling threatened? And then I try to reorient my stance to express that hurt and vulnerability and feel confident that that's the only way that I'm ever going to get anything accomplished. And what I really want to say is that being in this clear, calm, purpose-driven state of mind is incredibly difficult, and it takes hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice. I think of it like being in great cardiovascular shape if you're an athlete, because you can learn a lot of techniques for being trauma-informed, and that's like learning the actual skills of your game. But to actually be able to execute all those techniques, you have to be in great physical shape. And to do that, you have to run miles and miles every day, and you have to keep training, and you can never let that cardiovascular endurance slide, or else your game just suffers. So this is really the most foundational, most important thing that people need to learn to become a trauma-informed person, and then to help your organization become trauma-informed as well. Now, after you've done this for 100 hours of practice, then you can move on to some of the techniques that we'll go over in the next videos. Thank you.
All right. So what I'd like for you to do, I'm going to skip this one, is I'm not going to take you to Kahoot. That's going to take a few more minutes, but I want you to remember, what is your purpose? And share in the chat, what is your purpose? Why did you begin to do this work in the first place? Because as we listed ways that we are being abused, that can cause us to lose sight of why we really started doing this work. So if you're comfortable, share in the chat. What is your purpose? What was your purpose by getting into human services, working with those who've experienced trauma? All right, I see some popping up in the chats. To promote equity, all right, to help people. We have the right to experience safety and pleasure and health. And sometimes we forget that because we put others above ourselves. Empathetic listening and advocacy facilitate hope and possible change. Yes. Sometimes that's empowering for someone to know that there's options, because life can feel hopeless, especially if you've lived years and years with lots of abuse. To help children and families experience joy. I love it. Commitment to equitable, positive health for all. To level the playing field. And so keeping some of these things in mind, as you get knocked down a little bit, and to brush it off, remember, okay, this is why I'm staying the course. Remind folks that they deserve to enjoy life. I love it. Vulnerable people deserve advocacy. Yes, purpose, advocate for those in my community and a system that has thus far not recognized them. I love, love, love the purposes. I'm gonna have to borrow some of these. So with that, there's more, but I think that's our basic. I'm gonna stop here and not overload. But keeping in mind what your purpose is, that is the key. Well, I'm not here, stop sharing. That is the key to being more responsive. It starts with you. If you're at a place that you're dysregulated, you're not gonna see the needs, you're not gonna remember your purpose, so you're not gonna seek out, oh, I said I wanted to advocate. So you might miss some opportunities because you're like, I'm tired of fighting because everybody's fighting against me. And so keeping your purpose in mind. So I will share the PowerPoint with you all and the link to the video. It's on YouTube, and I love this particular one. Oh, I'm sorry, in my last 2 minutes, I have to share the last video with you. Forgot about that one. Give me a second. So one of the things that to get us out of survival mode is some of the things we did, being much more mindful, calm, and taking the moment for silence is needed. But supporting each other, keeping an eye on each other, because we're all in this together and experiencing very similar things. Communicate when you're overwhelmed. Be trauma informed with yourself, you all. Have as much empathy for yourself. I know you're like, empathy, how can I be empathetic with myself? Yes, be empathetic with yourself as much as you are with other people, and make sure that you engage in self-care to stay regulated. And self-care is going to vary from person to person. But here's this last piece in terms of empathy, and I love, this is from Brené Brown, so we're going to close with this in terms of what empathy is. Let's see, did I do the sound right? Share screen. Yes, okay. Okay.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. So that is empathy. And it's about building connections, even sometimes reconnecting with yourself. So I want to thank you all for sitting in with me and for engaging interactively. Again, I will upload this to the NOVA Act. I will stay in the room for just a few minutes. I'd like to download the chat if I can do that. Let's see, show chat previews. No. Okay. But other than that, you go forth remembering your purpose, and to be sure to be kind to yourself and empathetic with yourself, and to take care of yourself. So thank you, thank you, thank you.